The Dutch East India Company settlements in China, Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, the Pescadores Island, and the northern part of Vietnam in the 17th century helped to build a bigger Sinic cosmopolis that was culturally diverse but interlinked with the maritime trades. But the Dutch East India Company, better known as VOC, remained peripheral in these regions, either by choice or necessity. There were two diverging trade routes south from China. The western route, primarily controlled by Portuguese, passing through Cambodia, Siam, the Malaysian Peninsula, and Sumatra to Java. The eastern route, under Spanish control, passing through Philippines to the Maluku Islands. The Dutch gradually took over the Portuguese route, gaining increasing political and economic control of the areas surrounding the annexed ports of Batavia, Malacca, Makassar, and Molucas. At the end of the 17th century, there was an unprecedented growth in Chinese economy and demography, and its sheer size overshadowed almost all the coastal trade center in China Sea. Rising China was a significant threat to neighboring principalities, including Japan, as there was a constant threat of losing internal political control as a result of a continuous influx of Chinese immigrants. But in the far-flung colonial trading centers such as Batavia and Manila, Chinese goods and services were required and generally welcomed. However, as the reliance on Chinese migrants grew in these cities, concerns about Sinophobia surfaced, resulting in various pogroms and organized massacre of Chinese. The exponential expansion of China's economy affected mainland Southeast Asia more than the Indonesian archipelago. But VOC could only watch and at best try to get a piece of the action. The exception was Taiwan, which, like Ceylon and Java, was heavily colonized by the VOC, albeit slightly earlier and for a shorter period of time than the other two islands, and was ultimately annexed by the Manchus after the VOC was driven out of Fort Zeelandia. Despite the cultural and religious divide between the Theravada Buddhist southeast mainland and the primarily Muslim archipelago, there have been close economic bonds between the two regions for centuries. The mountains in the interior of the countries, with their dense tropical forests, formed a natural barrier against Chinese expansion, while several large rivers provided relatively good maritime access through the southern coastal areas, making connection with the archipelago and other maritime regions of Asia relatively easy. In earlier times, Southeast Asia had a pattern of settlement with relatively small, widely dispersed, densely populated, and intensively built up core areas in the middle of the vast tropical forests, which were simple to control by princes with their firm eyes on connecting rivers and deltas. In the 15th century, a significant shift took place. The constant dry climate as well as the introduction of new crops and cultivation methods made it easier to cultivate and populate the marshy river deltas. And between 1450 and 1680s, during the Age of Commerce, the relative importance of inter-regional trade as a source of income for local princes also increased significantly. Both development played important roles in increasing orientation towards the southern coastal regions, in Burma towards Pegu, in Thailand towards Ayutthaya, in Cambodia towards Phnom Penh, and in Vietnam towards Champa. Furthermore, due to the lack of rain during the period, food imports from these coasts also increased and emerged as important centers. But the growing presence of Chinese traders, as well as the demographic, political, and military dominance of the interior regimes, as well as the lack of any monopoly goods, prevented the VOC from establishing its own power base in these coastal areas. Nonetheless, the VOC's maritime trade activities have undoubtedly accelerated regions' move toward the coast. In the medieval period, despite new military technology, China remained heavily dependent on the availability of the mounted warriors and war horses from Central Asia, resulting in a key political and military areas centered on the nomadic posture of the far north borders areas around the Great Wall. Consequently, in 1403, Ming moved the capital from Nanking to Beijing. The agriculture region of the Yangtze valleys and the southeast coast, Fujian and Guangdong, had also undergone rapid development and become important for food security. Accordingly, the Yangtze River was deepened and the Grand Canal extended further to the north, making the transportation of food for imperial armies easier without use the much less manageable coastal sea traffic. But just as in the north, for the Chinese authority, there was always danger of separatist dynamics along the coast, leading to regional revolts and autonomy. To counter this, initially Ming adopted a policy of expansion by sea, sending court-enhanced Zheng He with large flotillas 7 times to the Indian Ocean to persuade princes to pay tributes. But most probably due to the cost of external expeditions, the decision was taken not to engage in such expeditions further. Instead, the Chinese implemented a strict system of licensed trading cities, traders, and destinations, focusing on the fertile provinces of Fujian and Guangdong. This allowed foreign shipping to be outlawed outside these zones, leading to the criminalization of free maritime trade as piracy. The Nursai-led Manchu dynasty, also known as the Qing, increased military might and a state formation of Beijing's northeast, which resulted in the occupation of Beijing in 1644. The Qing dynasty, which ruled from 1644 to 1911, heavily controlled foreign trade in the coastal areas, leading to the expansion of the Chinese economy and increased opportunity for maritime traders. This period of political and economic growth was crucial for neighboring states, including the VOC, to make good use of it without being overwhelmed by it. China was one of the earliest destinations of Dutch merchants after the Spice Island, but it was clear that anyone engaging in trade with China would face strong opposition from the Portuguese operating from Macau. In 1605 and 1607, the Dutch attempts to make the leap to the mainland failed due to the fierce opposition of a Kongsai association of Portuguese and Chinese mandarins. The Chinese attitude during this period was clear. Canton in the Pearl River Delta was designated as the only port where foreign merchants were admitted, even then under strict trading conditions. The Portuguese in Macau, at the mouth of the same river, served as watchdogs against the pirates, including the Dutch. Only the merchants of Fujian were allowed to sail overseas, and initially they traded with the Dutch only outside China, mainly in Patani and Banten. Therefore, the internal Chinese political structure, rather than the wishes of Lord 17, had more impact on the history of Dutch trade relations with China, as VOC initially had to comply with the suspicious attitude of Ming authorities during the 17th century. Between 1620 and 1660, the VOC managed to benefit from the growing autonomy of Fujian under the pirate prince Zheng dynasty. After the opening of the Japanese trading post at Hirado in 1609, the VOC became increasingly aware of the importance of the China trade. It aimed to break into the lucrative silk for silver trade as much as possible without access to a trading post in China. Looking at this, Governor General Jan Peterson Cohen proposed using force to drive the Portuguese out of Macau and construct a castle on Pescadores. This plan was implemented in 1622, and quite surprisingly, this time it was not a complete fiasco. After a failed attack on Macau, under the leadership of Cornelis Richardson, the Dutch moved to the Pescadores to build a fortress, which ultimately led to the first negotiation with the Chinese government. And in 1624, under threat of violence and thanks to the mediation of the Fujian merchant Li Dan, the company got the opportunity to establish a new settlement on the island of Taiwan, outside the control of Ming authorities. This was probably tolerated because the Chinese wanted to create a counterweight to pirate merchants like Li Dan, who dominated the coastal water of Fujian. For the VOC, this signified the start of the 38-year-long colonization of Taiwan and also of a completely new phase in the trade with China. The company used Taiwan offer from the local Chinese governor by interpreting it as a legal contract, allowing the Dutch to gain local consent. They built a fort, Fort Zealandia, in exchange for territorial possession from the locals. With Taiwan and the Zheng regime cooperation, the VOC could exploit the lucrative silk for silver trade between China and Japan. The arrival of the Dutch in Taiwan marked a significant evolution for the local population, introducing new crops, oxen, irrigation works, and increased deer hunting. Dutch colonization laid the foundation for significant changes under Chinese administration in the centuries to follow, paving the way for Taiwan's Sinification. The Dutch government structure, court system, and the local magistrate all had an impact on the region's administration. Chinese immigrant peasants who formed councils became the engine of the agrarian expansion in Taiwan. But they could not prevent the farmers uprising in 1652 in protest against an excessive capitation tax. The Chinese were defeated with the help of native Taiwanese support troops and violence. The idea of country diets or Landtagen for the indigenous population originated from missionary Robert Junius, who served in Taiwan from 1629 to 1643. Junius was a successful administrator and military commander, emphasizing the importance of preaching in local language and teaching the Dutch language. Taiwan was a successful Protestant mission in the Dutch East India Company between 1627 and 1657, with 32 ministers serving to convert about 10,000 Taiwanese. The ministers served as intermediaries between VOC management and Taiwanese, contributing to the pacification of the island. Commercial profits, exploitation, and military successes contributed to the creation of a flourishing Dutch colony. However, the 1650s saw a Chinese uprising, epidemics, locust plagues, and earthquakes, which reshaped the mission's appeal. The growing conflict between the Qing and Zheng dynasties also made trading difficult, leading to the replacement of Chinese silk with the Tonkinese and Bengali silk by VOC. The win-win relationship between the VOC and the Zheng ended when the Zheng attacked Taiwan and defeated the Dutch. VOC was able to manage a free retreat while leaving behind all merchandise, money, weaponry, and ammunition. The loss of Taiwan devastated the VOC directors. They attempted to restore the company's prestige in China with 3 naval expeditions in the 1660s to take an important role in between the Qing and Zheng forces, but with a little result. Chinese authorities made limited responses, and a joint attack on Taiwan in December 1664 was also unsuccessful due to Zheng's maritime might. With the introduction of porcelain as an important commodity for intra-Asian trade and export to Europe in 1655, the company decided to make a new attempt via a legation directly from the high government in Beijing. But the trade with the Fuzhou did not really get off the ground due to the ongoing struggle between the Zheng polity and the central Chinese government's resistance to legitimizing the Dutch trading post. During the Ming or Qing era, the Middle Kingdom only accepted tribute relations with foreign powers, and Chinese authorities saw no benefit in permanent contracts or semi-permanent privileges. After the Qing conquest of Taiwan in 1683, trade with China was officially opened, with Canton becoming an attractive Chinese emporium for foreign traders. However, the Dutch refused to accept this and decided to have a China's trade proceeded entirely through Batavia, including a new booming tea product. The VOC had a less control over the price and quality of tea and had to export an enormous amount of silver. Private tea trade was allowed in 1743, but the VOC contributed to play second fiddle in Canton due to its less keenness to pay in silver. The junk trade to Batavia faced strong competition from direct Chinese shipping, and the trade declined significantly after the massacre of Chinese in Batavia in 1740. The Dutch presence in China was peripheral compared to the Mughals in India, where the VOC operated relatively autonomously in partnership with the indigenous traders. In Canton, the Dutch were isolated along the coast and had little contact with the indigenous population, and intermediaries like trading agents and interpreters were unable to establish any power base. A number of occasions and development in the 17th century influenced Dutch-Japanese relations, highlighting the economic importance of Japanese silver and the changing dynamics between the two countries. In 1600, the first Dutch ship, the Liefde from Rotterdam, reached Japan, and incidentally its crew and arms played a role in the Battle of Sekigahara, marking the beginning of the Edo period under the Tokugawa shogunate. The official contacts between the Tokugawa shogunate and the Dutch East India Company were established in 1606. In the beginning, due to the aggressive maritime operation, the Dutch were mostly treated as pirates in Japan. This caused humiliating diplomatic issues, culminating in 1628 Newt's scandal, which surfaced due to the inappropriate taxing and mishandling of Japanese affairs by Peter Newt, governor of Taiwan from 1627 to 1629, who earlier experienced Japanese mistreatment during his stay in Japan. The situation was eventually resolved with the Peter Newt's extradition to Japan in 1632. Japan underwent a process of pacification and centralization under different warlords during the period. This policy also included contesting the Catholicism spread by the Jesuits and Franciscan priests in Japan. The production of precious metals like silver, gold, and copper, which were essential for foreign trade, particularly in acquiring Chinese silk and other goods, coincided with the economic prosperity during this time period. The trading was probably a welcome outlet for some of the Japanese Catholic converts, who were persecuted increasingly severely in the interior of the country. Nonetheless, in Japan, there was a growing fear that if these groups acquired too much power abroad, it might also affect internal stability, which had been achieved with so many difficulties. Therefore, greater restrictions on foreign trade were put in from 1633 onwards, and the Japanese were completely banned from leaving the country. Notwithstanding, the Dutch were among the few foreigners allowed to continue trading with Japan, partly because of their role in helping suppress the Simbara uprising and their willingness to renounce their Christian identity. In 1641, the Dutch were relocated to the artificial island of Decima in Nagasaki's port, taking over from the Portuguese. The Dutch-Japanese relation was focused on precious metal, first shifting from silver to gold and then later to copper when silver and gold exports were banned. The VOC played a central role in facilitating the trades, particularly on the Coromandel coast and Surat in India. Further, Japan's strict government supervision led to export restrictions on precious metals and raw silk, with measures such as Pankado system and import ceilings. The Sotoku reforms in 1715 further limited the VOC's trade to 2 ships a year. As the 18th century progressed, the importance of Dutch trading posts in Japan declined due to Japan's increasingly autocratic policies.